that was a great introduction to our topic today about clinical research in psychiatry. I'm going to talk to you today about initially the reason that this is the subject for this morning, and it has to do with the Lundbeck Foundation, and you'll understand why in a minute. I want to talk about our department's research landscape and the idea of the clinician scientist at Johns Hopkins and in the department. And I'll talk about and then I'll conclude with clinical implications of this concept of the clinician scientist. So the Lundbeck Foundation. I imagine everybody's familiar with this wonderful statue in our administration building, the Dome building. It is, of course, a statue of Jesus, and it says on its base, "Come unto me, all ye that are weary, and I will give you rest." Love that quote. You may not know that this is not the original version of this statue. The original version, this is a replica that was donated to Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1896, and this is the original. Now, it looks exactly the same, like the one we have, because we created an exact replica. But this is an 1833 statue, which is located in the Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen, Denmark, which I bring up because I was thinking about this when our friends from Lundbeck came to visit us recently. Lundbeck is a pharmaceutical company, and it's one of the very few pharmaceutical companies that's exclusively focused on brain medications. And so their motto is advancing brain health and transforming lives. The Lundbeck Company was started in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1915. And they have created a lot of psychiatric drugs, maybe most famously citalopram or Celexa and escitalopram or Lexapro. And they're a pretty big company. I say pretty big because there are far bigger pharmaceutical companies than this, but a $33 billion company to me sounds like a big company. They have a foundation, the Lundbeck Foundation, created by the widow of the man who founded the company. She created the foundation in 1954, and oddly, or at least it's not something I've heard of before, the foundation owns most of the company, or 70% of the company, and so they're a pretty wealthy foundation, and they award $75 to $150 million in grants each year. Well, they have a plan to not only hand out money for research, but actually create now, this is a new plan, a new thing that they're working on. They want to create a national research center in Denmark focused on clinical psychiatry. And their vice president, Jan Edberg, emailed me late spring, early summer this year, and said, "We have the ambition to establish an international and world-leading research center within clinical psychiatry in Denmark. We and our board have committed to this ambition, and we're now in a phase where we're looking for inspiration on organization of the center, but also content within the field of clinical psychiatry. Our approach includes asking the clinical research community to come up with proposals for how to organize a research center within clinical psychiatry in Denmark. For the latter, we have in our search for inspiration from leading centers and research units, not surprisingly, identified the Johns Hopkins Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences as a top candidate." So the top picture is the Jan Edberg, the vice president, and Lars Torup is the scientific program director. The two of them wound up coming to visit us there. There was supposed to be a three-person team, and the third person, who's a psychologist, got sick at the very last minute. So the two of them visited, and they said they wanted to focus, they had two areas of focus, two areas identified as having potential to make a significant difference for patients. The first is gaining a better understanding of how mental illness develops from the prenatal stage through to adulthood, with emphasis on early detection, prevention, and treatment. And the second area of focus is treatment options after illness onset, targeting the large group of patients who do not currently respond adequately to existing therapies, treatment-resistant patients. This also includes understanding the underlying disease mechanisms and conducting research into treatment in its broadest sense. So we had 3 days of meetings, and a number of you in the audience were part of those 3 days of meetings with them, and a very, very interesting set of discussions, and interesting enough that I found it very thought-provoking, and I thought, okay, I want to talk to all of you about these things. So with that, I'll turn to the research landscape in our department. And this meeting, the meeting with the Lundbeck folks got me thinking, well, what exactly does go on in our department? I wanted to be able to describe it to them. So we have about 917 people in the department if you are focused on people directly under departmental supervision. That is to say, it doesn't include nurses or social workers who are part of us in a way, but technically are supervised within the hospital. So we have about 917 people. About 240 of them are exclusively devoted to research. We have 503 faculty, that includes part-time faculty, 172 trainees, including these research-focused people who are fellows, grad students, and undergrads, 242 staff, about 131 of whom are research-focused. We have about $45 million a year in NIH grants, $12 million a year in other grants, so $57 million in grants altogether. And some of the people who help oversee all of this, I thought I would mention: Rita Cardam, our department administrator; Tim Moran, our executive vice chair; Michael Smith, our chair for faculty; Rita Pinetti, who's our faculty appointments coordinator; Suzanne Falbo, our associate administrator; and Cassandra Ferguson, our head of HR. It's a big operation, and it takes a lot of people to keep it all running. We have a number of divisions in the department that combine clinical care and research, and that includes child and adolescent psychiatry, with John Campos, the director, and Joe McGuire is the research director; geriatric psychiatry and neuropsychiatry, directed by Paul Rosenberg; medical psychology, directed by Tracy Van Orsdal; behavioral medicine, directed by Michael Smith; Mood Disorders Center, directed clinically by Karen Swartz; research by Fernando Goez and Peter Zandi; Eating Disorders Program Director Angela Guarda; Clinical Research Director Colleen Schreier; Reproductive Mental Health Center Research Director being Lisa Hansa. And then we have a bunch of divisions that are exclusively research-focused: Psychiatric Neuroimaging, directed by Arnold Bacher; Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, directed by Fred Barrett, with Al Garcia Romeo as Associate Director; BPRU, Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit, directed by Eric Strain; Molecular Psychiatry, which is very closely related to the Schizophrenia Center, which incorporates the clinical piece; but Molecular Psychiatry, headed by Akira Sawa; Behavioral Neuroscience, headed by Tim Moran; Neurobiology, directed by Chris Ross, with Associate Directors Russ Margolis and Wenjian Duan. So one more, yes. Behavioral Biology, co-directed by Elise Weertz and Eric Strain. So all of that research enterprise rests in some extent on some important infrastructure, like a biostatistics core that we have in the department, headed up by Jean Elliott Sakos; informatics core, headed up by Peter Zandi; brain imaging, where the imaging machines exist in the Kennedy Krieger Kirby Center, and then Arnold Bacher in our division has a kind of a processing of data from that core for processing of that data. We have a behavioral neuroscience core, which based in our department but serves the whole School of Medicine, headed up by Chantel Terillian. We have a clinical, Bayview has a clinical research unit, and our department is the biggest user of it. You see a photo of that here. And then we have a number of wet labs, a big one in the CMSC building, the newly renovated CMSC building. We have wet labs in the Ross building, in the Meyer building, and the Brady building at Bayview. So, research, of course, figures prominently in our departmental goals. Providing outstanding care is a crucial goal for our community, often through general psychiatry, for those referred in for subspecialized and complex care. But advancing the field through research is a big part of our goal, and I'm going to divide out a bunch of different aspects of our research goals. We try to advance basic understanding of disease, and I'm not going to read through the examples, but I'm listing a few for you to have a look at. Developing new treatments is a huge part of our research goals, and that got a lot of attention with this Newsweek cover a few years back, trumpeting a new new treatment for depression, magic mushrooms or psilocybin. And that article features our department prominently. Testing new interventions is another big piece of it. Disseminating best practices, prevention of illness, enhancing wellness. We have research that goes on in all of these areas. And of course, we want to train the next generation as another major goal, as well as increase access to care. So let me talk a little bit about the clinician scientist at Hopkins and in the department. Our institution was created with the idea of the clinician scientist at the fore. Hopkins Hospital and the School of Medicine were created to be a joint, more or less a joint enterprise. That is, the clinical care and the research and training being conjoined. And that was based on the German model at the time, where the clinician scientist was championed. And most of you are going to be familiar with our big four, the four founders of Hopkins Medicine. William Osler was an internist who combined clinical observation with scientific inquiry. William Welch was a clinical pathologist who spent a lot of his time working on lab-based scientific methods to advance that field. Howard Kelly and William Halstead combined surgical practice with training and research. In our department, Adolf Meyer, our founder, was a very serious clinician who also got an MD and then did a doctorate thesis. He wrote over 400 papers. A number of them very much brought together clinical care and research. For example, one in the American Journal of Psychiatry on the anatomical facts and clinical varieties of traumatic insanity. On the issue of the clinician scientist, he said, psychiatry can never be a science like the others. It doesn't want to be. What we need is more common sense and courage to study whatever needs to be studied. Then we can form a science which has its roots in life at large. Meyer is sometimes criticized for being somewhat obscure in his writing, and people often attribute it to the fact that English was not his first language, or it may just be that he thought in very convoluted ways. But what essentially he's saying here is that we can't be a science that's rooted strictly in biology. He really meant our science is not strictly biological. It needs to be a science that encompasses the study of the clinical world and people's environment as well as their brain. Our department has made lots of important research, contributions to clinical research, maybe the most famous being this one, this 1943 article by Leo Kanner, entitled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, which constituted the discovery of autism. Certainly we take lots of credit for the mini mental state exam, about which much was written. Marshall Folstein, one of the authors of the mini mental, published this paper in JAMA, which is very, very highly cited population norms for the mini-mental. Many of you will know that the original mini-mental state paper is one of, if not the most highly cited papers in all of medicine. We can't exactly take credit for it because the three authors are all people who became incredibly important members of our department, but they wrote the paper before they came to Hopkins. They were at Oregon. This work from the BPRU, on establishing buprenorphine as one of the really important drugs to treat opioid dependence is incredibly important, led by George Bigelow and Eric Strain and others, and this is one of the important papers they published on this topic in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000. And then most recently, the revival of psychedelic science and psychiatric therapeutics has been incredibly impactful. This paper, this 2016 paper, here on psilocybin as an effective treatment for depression and anxiety in people with terminal cancer, is the single most highly cited paper in the history of the psychedelic field. Our leaders have practiced, have been clinician scientists, and helped lead our department, continued to advance our department in that direction. Paul McHugh was a great clinician, and one example of that is the great care that he provided to a very famous patient, Tom Wolfe, most famous for the novels Bonfire of the Vanities and The Right Stuff. In his dedication to another of his novels, A Man in Full, he writes, "With immense admiration, the author dedicates A Man in Full to Paul McHugh, whose brilliance, comradeship, and unfailing kindness saved the day." Tom Wolfe was public about being a patient here, as you can see. But Paul McHugh made many contributions to clinical research. I just mentioned the mini-mental state, his most famous product. But he had a lot of, he made contributions in a variety of areas, one of them being mood disorder as a specific complication of stroke, published in 1977. There are many other examples. Ray DiPaolo continued in that tradition. Ray was and is a magnificent clinician, and a lot of his clinical wisdom is in his two books on depression. Here's one of them, Understanding Depression, What We Know and What You Can Do About It. And Ray made many research contributions, initially working on the relationship, initially looking at lithium and potential dangers of it. This paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1986 showed that lithium was less dangerous to kidneys than some people had been suggesting. One of my favorite papers of his is this one that I'm the first author on. Ray mentored me on this first major paper of mine, Attempted Suicide and Alcoholism in Bipolar Disorder, Clinical and Familial Relationships, from 2000. I was talking to Tim Moran about this Grand Rounds during the summer and about the idea for this Grand Rounds, and he immediately said, "Oh, well, of course, Grand Rounds itself is a prime example of the spirit of the clinician scientist in the department." And I thought that was quite an interesting insight. You will hear this year primarily from clinician scientists. Some of them are PhDs, like Tracy Speed, Liz Gerber, and Fred Nucifora. An awful lot of them, we have an awful lot of clinician scientists who are not MD PhDs, like Joe McGuire and Andrea Young, Russ Margolis, Kostas Laketsos, Durga Roy, Nicola Kishela, Chadi Onike, Liz Reynolds, Paul Rosenberg, who you see here. But you know, what we do here is we present a patient. We focus on the patient's clinical issues for most Grand Rounds, although not this particular one. There's some discussion about the clinical issue the person is dealing with and what we know about it and what the best way to manage it is. And then there's some discussion about the research that's being done to advance our understanding of the problem. So the issue of the clinical scientist, in relation to the MD PhD is something that Jake Taylor wrote about a couple years ago. Now, my name is on this, as you may notice, but the truth is I did some wordsmithing of this document, but 99.5% of the thinking in this viewpoint is Jake's. He wrote about the idea of training physician scientists, and he was speaking from his experience as an associate residency program director of Brigham and Women's in Boston. He talked about training physician scientists, and really the point of what he had to say was that so often the emphasis is on creating great scientists, and he wanted people who are great scientists and also great clinicians. And the notion was that great clinician part was being neglected. And so he said, psychiatrists, scientists are uniquely positioned to lead efforts to translate scientific findings into benefits for patients. And well-trained psychiatrist scientists improve scientific rigor in clinical research. And psychiatrist scientists whose work bears directly on interventions and patient outcomes are well equipped to help develop and improve clinical guidelines. And the habits of mind taught by scientific training and clinical psychiatry can be mutually reinforcing. Expertise in both research and clinical work can position people to identify flaws in conceptual frameworks used in each endeavor. And proximity to the clinical enterprise may motivate and inspire scientists whose work will benefit patients. So we have quite a few MD PhDs in our residency right now. Sam Scharf, Jared, who you just heard from, Derek Barisas, Carlos Rico, Lauren Marazzi-Hinson, Matt Engel, and Michael Kovacs. We have 7 in the residency, and we have 23 MD PhDs in the department. 10 of them, I won't go through all the names because there's a lot, but you can see them here. 10 of them came through our residency, the ones in green. And 13 of them came later in their training or career. But, and MD PhDs are terrific. They bring they bring a diverse skill set, and they're wonderful. And other clinician scientists are wonderful too. But no single person, it's very rare that one single person can do it all. And no single person has to do it all. In fact, that's not the way things work. The term team science gets used a lot these days, and it should, because research really is a team sport. One person, Rick Hugenir, actually, the chair of neuroscience, said this to me a while back, talked about what he thought of as the ideal triad for research. And I think it's an interesting concept, this idea that if you have a clinician who's focused on clinical work but has an interest in research, and you pair that person with a clinician scientist, and then in addition with a pure researcher, that triad can be extremely powerful. And one that occurred to me is that in the schizophrenia realm, Nicola Cascella is a great clinician who's very much research oriented. Akira Sawa is trained clinically and is an MD PhD, and Kun Yang is a computational biologist in the schizophrenia group, and that's a good combo. But the truth is there are a lot of variations that can work. There are a lot of ways to make clinical research happen. So why am I telling you all of this? Partly I'm telling you all this in Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds is Grand Rounds, of course, the Grand Rounds audience is largely clinically oriented, and I think that there are clinical implications for this concept. And I guess the clinical implications, to my mind, really kind of hinge on this interconnection between data for discovery and hope for healing. I think they work hand in hand. Now everybody's familiar with this recent campaign that Hopkins has generated, the Research Saves Lives campaign. But there's also been Research Means Hope campaigns, And I think it's true that medical research is the beginning of hope. So how does research make us better clinicians? Well, I think research really can help inspire hope. I know it can because I've seen it in lots of patients. You know, I think when a clinician is involved in research, it can confer in the patient a sense that the clinician has the power to heal. It's one of a number of things that can do it. I think the demonstration of command. I think clinician scientists tend to have command of the evidence base. They tend to know what's been shown consistently to work and what things might have been talked about a lot but actually really have fairly flimsy support. As Jake alluded to, I think research involves training and thinking rigorously. And that kind of training can be really useful when it comes to weighing the pros and cons of various treatment choices. And I think clinical data collection for research can give us a clearer view of what it is we're seeing over time. And sometimes, and potentially the ability to actually make use of that data in real time. And that's a big thing that Peter Zandi and his MyCare team, which includes Jason Straub, who's been terrific and I know helped a lot of people in the department. This is just an example of one of the projects that Peter and Jason and their team have been involved in. That is a project where data from questionnaires are collected, in this case the PHQ-9 rating scale for depression, and the data gets collected and clinicians can visualize it. A patient comes in and you can call up a graph that shows in this case that PHQ-9 scores were elevated this past fall, October, November, December, and then I say this past, I guess it was fall of 24, and then in the first 6 months of 25, the PHQ-9 scores had clearly come down, and the patient was clearly in a better place. And then beneath it is sort of particular questions and particular responses to items on the PHQ-9, so you can have a sense of where people's scores might be elevated. So, putting it all together, I think that integration of research and clinical care gives us a better handle on what constitutes evidence-based treatment. It allows us to practice evidence-based treatment in a more effective way. It helps us to understand what we know and where the edge of knowledge is. That is, what we know and what we don't know. And I think that kind of mastery can help inspire a sense of hope in patients. So, in conclusion, we are a leading center for clinical research in psychiatry and a source of inspiration to others who are seeking to do similar work. Our research enterprise in the department is extensive. It benefits from core facilities that provide support in areas like informatics, biostatistics, and brain imaging. The clinician scientist has been at the core of Johns Hopkins generally and of our department since the beginning. And the idea has always been that we take great care of patients and work to discover better approaches to healing them. Grand Rounds ideally exemplifies this, and most of this year's presenters as clinician scientists will talk about a patient, their clinical issue, and what they're doing to improve understanding and/or treatment of it. Research makes us better clinicians. It forces us to dive into the literature in depth, appreciate what we as a field know and what we don't know. So we work at the cutting edge of the evidence base. And our depth of understanding and our knowledge of what breakthroughs might lie ahead and our immersion in the work of helping bring them about all inspire hope in our patients as they sense that we have the power to heal. With that, happy to take questions. Thoughts? maybe I'll call on Jake. You're here. Where are you, Jake? Yeah, the research mission hinges on research funding. There's no doubt about it. And the NIH has been clearly the biggest source of funding for us and every other major medical center. The answer, the Lundbeck Foundation. No, I mean, there are non-governmental sources of funding, and some of them are very much thinking about the fact that needs may well rapidly become greater, and I think some of them are gearing up to try to be helpful. Philanthropy certainly is a similar sort of thing. I've had a couple of our donors say, "Gosh, times are tough. Is there anything we can do?" That's nice. I suppose the other thing I would say is a lot of important research hinges on is expensive, but conversely, there are things that can be done in the research arena that are less expensive, and I suppose it might be that we'll be thinking hard about some of those before long, if we need to. So, Paul.
Another thing that you could think about 2025, besides the funding, there's also a lot more pushback against science and the trusting of research.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm wondering, is there any role for our department in fighting the corner case that we will get against cost of action? We can show lots of studies, but what's the other interest in finding
Yeah.
public access?
Yeah, well, that's a good question from our Provost Fellow for Public Engagement. Yeah, it's a great point. I think communication about research, broadly speaking, is an important issue in a whole lot of ways. One of them being in the clinical environment. That is to say, when we talk to our patients about research, we need to actually communicate to them in a way that they understand, which is easier said than done. All of us in this room live, in this particular subculture, the medical subculture. And the medical subculture has its own language, and we don't always recognize the need to actually translate into plain English for people. So I think it's more inspiring to a patient to hear research that they can understand, a research message that they can understand. With regard to the general public, same thing in terms of if we're going to persuade people, legislators, we need to be able to speak. We need to be able to talk about what we do in plain English, and I know you do a phenomenal job with that, Paul. So maybe the answer is you need to train everybody else in the department. Actually, that might not be a bad idea, now that I think about it. Thank you for volunteering for that. Other thoughts, Ray? Oh, yeah, good point. I forgot about that. That's a great point. I got to mention that to our Lundbeck people who I'm still communicating with. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, the lithium story, for those who don't know it, it's an incredibly fascinating trajectory. Well, I'll just interject one of my favorite lithium stories is that there's so many patients who say they're not going to take your medicine, they're only going to use something that's natural. People say that sometimes. I just heard that last week, which got me thinking about it. And which reminds me of reading National Geographic. We subscribed to it at home, and I picked up National Geographic a long time ago. And there was the story was about the origins of the universe. And so I'm flipping through this, and it says, yeah, in the beginning, the Big Bang, there were only 3 elements: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. And I thought, okay, 13 billion years. That doesn't get much more natural than that. Other thoughts? Questions, Jerry? Well, I wish we were invited to make a proposal to the Lundbeck Foundation. No, it wasn't so much. It wasn't so much that they were coming to see what we were going to propose and fund it. At least the way it was framed is they basically wanted to learn from us so that they could fund a new center at one of the major hospitals in Copenhagen. They wanted to create something like a Lieber Institute at one of the biggest hospitals in Copenhagen. I say something like Lieber because Lieber, of course, is very, very biology oriented, and this is meant to be more clinically oriented research. But at the moment, the conversation is continuing, so I'm not sure where it's going to wind up. What would you propose, Jerry? Other questions, thoughts, comments? Okay. If not, thanks everybody. Take care.